The rifle was already in Caleb Horne's hands when the door burst open. Not knocked, not opened. Burst. A woman fell across his threshold, one arm locked around a small child, the other pressed hard against her ribs where the snow had gone dark and red. She looked up at him, not with fear, not with pleading, with the flat, stripped-bare eyes of someone who had already buried every person who'd ever promised to help her. "They murdered my husband," she said. "They're coming for me next. Please, hide my daughter." If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Caleb Horne had not opened that door for anyone in 8 years. Not for neighbors, not for preachers, not for the circuit judge who'd ridden out twice, asking questions Caleb had no intention of answering. The cabin sat high on a ridge in Wyoming territory, 15 miles from the nearest town, and that distance was not an accident. He'd measured it himself. He'd needed every one of those miles between himself and the rest of the human race. He'd been sitting by the dead fire, too tired to light it, too cold to care, when the horse screamed outside. Not a whinny, a scream. The sound a horse made when it had been pushed past the edge of what living things were meant to endure. He was on his feet before he knew he'd moved, rifle in his hands. He crossed to the door and opened it just wide enough to see. The blizzard hit him full in the face like a fist, and through the white wall of it, he saw them. A bay mare, barely standing, sides heaving, ice crusted thick across her neck and flanks. On the mare's back, a woman, small, dark coat, one arm wrapped around the horse's neck, and one arm locked around a child sitting in front of her. A girl, small enough that the coat swallowed her whole. The woman's head was down, not sleeping, trying not to fall. Caleb stepped back and started to close the door. Then the child looked up. She looked straight at him, straight through the dark and the driving snow, and her eyes were so steady, so achingly awake, that his hand stopped on the door handle and would not move. The woman slid off the horse. She didn't fall gracefully. She went down hard, one knee, then both hands. Then she caught herself and held, arms shaking, head hanging. The child dropped down beside her and grabbed her arm and tried to pull her upright, and couldn't. She was 9 years old, maybe, trying to lift a grown woman out of the snow with her bare hands. Caleb swore under his breath. He crossed the yard in 8 strides and got an arm around the woman before she went down the rest of the way. She flinched hard when he touched her. Full body flinch, like a woman who'd been grabbed before, and not kindly. And her free hand came up fast, something in it, a small knife, blade out. "Easy," Caleb said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him. Her face was dead white except for 2 spots of fever red high on her cheeks. Her eyes were brown and sharp and exhausted and calculating all at once, taking him apart, measuring him, deciding in about 3 seconds whether he was going to be the next man to make her life worse. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice was raw, stripped. "No, ma'am. My name's Caleb Horne. I live here." He didn't reach for the knife. "You need to get inside before this cold finishes what it started." She looked at him another long moment. Then she folded the knife and put it back in her coat pocket. He got her inside. The child came without being asked, moving silently at her mother's side, one small hand gripping the back of the woman's coat like she intended to anchor her to the earth. Caleb set the woman down on the bench by the cold fireplace and went to work on the fire without speaking. He heard her breathing behind him, controlled, deliberate, a person managing pain, and heard nothing from the child at all. Not a sound. He got the fire going, turned around. The woman was watching him with those brown eyes, steady, wary. The girl was watching him too. She hadn't let go of her mother's coat. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. "Margaret Cole," the woman said. "Maggie." She glanced down at the child. "This is my daughter, Eliza." He looked at the girl. "Hey, Eliza." Eliza looked back at him, said nothing. Her eyes were dark and direct, and they did not look like the eyes of a frightened child. They looked like the eyes of someone much older who happened to be living in a child's body. "She doesn't talk," Maggie said. "No apology in it. Just the fact, clean and flat. The way you stated something you'd already cried about until you had no tears left for it." "She hasn't. Not since October." Caleb nodded. He didn't ask why. "You're bleeding," he said. "I know." "How bad?" "Bad enough." "Let me see." She pulled back. Slight movement, but clear. "I don't need—" "You came to my door," Caleb said, not unkindly. "You're bleeding in my cabin. I need to know if you're going to die tonight, because if you are, I need to know before morning." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to hurt you, Mrs. Cole. I give you my word." She studied him. He let her. He'd learned a long time ago that the best thing you could say to a frightened woman was nothing at all. Just hold still and let her see you weren't a threat. Some men never figured that out. Finally, she moved her hand away from her side. The wound was a deep gouge along her ribs, maybe 4 inches long. A blade, not a bullet. Recent, 2 days old at most. "They caught up to us outside Red Rock," she said, while he cleaned it. Her voice was flat and deliberate, the way people talked when they were describing something they needed to get through without falling apart. "2 men. We were at an inn. They came through the back. I got Eliza out the window first." "And the men?" "I got away." A pause. "The second one got a piece of me." Caleb said nothing. He worked carefully. Eliza was watching his hands. When he reached for the clean cloth, she was already holding it out to him. He looked at her, surprised. She met his eyes and waited. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, one slow, serious nod. He finished and sat back. "Where are you headed?" Maggie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured, like a woman who had already told this story to sheriffs and judges and traveled men, and had been ignored every single time, and was deciding whether it was worth the breath. "Cheyenne," she said, "there's a federal marshal there, a real one, not one that belongs to Governor Stokes." Caleb's hands went still. He looked at her. "Harlan Stokes." "You know him?" "I know of him." His jaw tightened. "Big man. Territory man. The kind that's got his name on a building somewhere." 3 buildings, Maggie said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite bitterness. Bitterness had heat in it. This was colder. "And a courthouse. And the sheriff's office in 4 counties. Caleb set the cloth down. "Tell me." She told him. Her husband had been Thomas Cole. Reverend Thomas Cole. Preacher. Former newspaper correspondent. A man who, according to Maggie, had believed with his whole stubborn soul that the truth was worth more than safety. He'd been serving a congregation in Laramie County when he started noticing the same pattern Maggie described, now in a voice that never once trembled, though her hands did. Families losing their land, deeds going missing, legal paperwork appearing from nowhere, filed by Stokes' attorneys, transferring title. Homesteads that had been in families for 20 years, suddenly belonging to the governor's land company. Thomas had started writing it down. Names, dates, signatures he'd identified as forgeries by comparing them to documents he'd dug out of county records. Families who'd been threatened, bought out for nothing, run off their land in the middle of winter with nowhere to go. He'd built an evidence file that was, Maggie said quietly, enough to bring Stokes down, enough to have him removed from office and tried for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. He'd been 3 days from sending it to the federal marshal's office when they came for him. October 14th, Maggie said. Night. They came to the church. Thomas was working late. He did that. She stopped, started again. Eliza had gone to bring him supper. She was there when they came in. Caleb looked at the girl. Eliza was looking at the fire. Her face was perfectly still. She saw them kill him, Maggie said. Her voice did not break, but Caleb watched something move behind her eyes, a wave of something vast and dark that she pushed back down by sheer force of will. She ran. She got home, and I got the journal, and we ran. We've been running since then. She met Caleb's eyes. 3 months and 2 days. The fire crackled. Outside, the blizzard threw itself against the walls of the cabin. The journal, Caleb said. You have it. Maggie's hand moved to the inside of her coat. Instinctive, protective. Yes. Then you have everything Stokes needs to kill you for. Yes. And you came here. The storm came up faster than we expected. We couldn't make it to the next town. She held his gaze. I wasn't going to ask this of a stranger. I want you to know that. I don't ask things of people. I've learned not to. The way she said it was not self-pity. It was information. Here is what I've learned. Here is what the world has taught me. But Eliza can't ride any further tonight, and if I'd pushed the mare another mile, she'd have gone down in the snow. She paused. So, I'm asking. What are you asking for? 1 night, Maggie said. Just tonight. We'll be gone before first light. Caleb looked at her for a long time. 8 years. 8 years he'd kept this door shut, kept the world at exactly the distance it needed to be, kept himself in the quiet and the cold and the particular kind of numbness that came from having nothing left to hurt. He'd built this life very carefully, out of absence. No attachments, no obligations, no chances to do to anyone else what he'd done to Aaron Webb. He looked at Eliza. The girl had turned her head and was looking at him again with those steady, ancient eyes. He thought about Aaron Webb. 34 years old, accused of a crime he hadn't committed. Caleb had testified against him, had told himself he was telling the truth, that he'd seen what he'd seen, that the law was the law. Had sat in that courtroom and watched Aaron Webb's wife grip the back of the bench and listened to Caleb's words put a noose around her husband's neck. 3 months later, the real killer had confessed. Aaron Webb was already in the ground. Caleb had ridden out to Wyoming territory the following spring and built this cabin and shut the door. You can stay, he said. Maggie's face didn't change much, but something in her shoulders moved. A fraction of letting go. A fraction of weight set down, so small that most people wouldn't have caught it. Caleb caught it. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. He stood and went to the window. The snow was coming down hard and white and relentless. In the morning we'll see what the roads look like. If the storm breaks, I can get you a fresh horse and point you toward Cheyenne. 15 miles south, there's a man named Walt Gruber who runs a stage relay. He's not a Stokes man. He'll get word to the marshal if we ask him right. And if the storm doesn't break? Then we wait. Maggie nodded. All right. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you said you know of Stokes. I lived in this territory 8 years. Caleb didn't turn from the window. Man like that casts a long shadow. Did you ever work for him? The question landed quietly. No accusation in it, just the question. No, Caleb said. Did you ever work for the law? A longer pause this time. Once, he said. She didn't ask more. He was grateful for that. He heard a small sound behind him, not Maggie. He turned. Eliza had pulled something from her coat pocket. A small, folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. She crossed the room to him in 4 quiet steps and held it up. Caleb looked down at it, then at her. Her eyes said, "Take it." He took it, unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was a child's, careful, deliberate, each letter shaped with effort. But the words were clear. "If bad men come, please don't let them take my mama. She didn't do anything wrong. My papa would want me to ask." Caleb read it twice. His throat tightened in a way it hadn't in 8 years. He looked at Eliza. Her face was solemn and unafraid, and she was watching him the way children watched adults when they were deciding whether the adult was worth trusting. A calculation far more serious and accurate than most adults ever gave children credit for. He folded the note, held it back out to her. She shook her head, left it with him. Then she went back to her mother's side and sat down and laced her fingers through Maggie's and stared at the fire. Caleb stood there with the note in his hand. From the window, a sound cut through the wind, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Single rider. Moving fast despite the storm. Caleb went for the rifle before the sound had fully registered. He was at the window, shutters cracked, rifle up, scanning the dark and the white before he'd consciously decided to move. Muscle memory from a life he'd tried to leave behind. The rider came out of the storm and pulled up hard in front of the cabin. He was bundled to the eyes against the cold. But Caleb recognized the horse. Ed Garrity's roan. From Millhaven, 12 miles east. He lowered the rifle slightly, but he did not put it down. "Caleb Horne!" The rider's voice was muffled by his scarf, but carried through the wind. Ragged, urgent. "You in there? Horne, answer me!" "I hear you, Garrity." Caleb kept his voice even. "What do you want?" Garrity pulled the scarf from his face. He was a big man, raw-boned, mid-40s, not the kind that frightened easy. He looked frightened now. "I need to talk to you. Open up." "Talk from there." A pause. Garrity looked at the door, looked back at the dark behind him. "Stokes' men are riding," he said lower. 8, maybe 10 of them. They're asking about a woman and a girl, a widow. They're saying she killed a man in Laramie, stabbed him in cold blood. He swallowed. They're asking every homestead in the county. Caleb said nothing. "I ain't seen them," Garrity said. "That's what I'm telling every man they ask." A beat. "But McCaffrey at the relay station, he's Stokes' man, and he saw a bay mare turn north off the main road 2 hours ago." Garrity's voice dropped lower. "Caleb, if you got those people, you need to know what's coming." "How many hours back are they?" 4, maybe 3, with the storm clearing on the south route. Behind him, Caleb heard Maggie stand. He didn't turn around. "Garrity," he said, "you tell anyone you came here?" "No." "You tell anyone you were coming here tonight?" "No." "Then you never came here." Caleb held the man's gaze. "You rode out in the storm and turned back. That's all." Garrity stared at him. "Caleb, they'll burn you out if they have to. Stokes' men don't leave—" "I heard you, Ed." His voice was flat and final. "You never came here." A long silence. Garrity pulled his scarf back up over his face. He looked at Caleb with something that might have been respect and might have been sorrow. The way a man looked at another man walking a road that only went one direction. God be with you, he said. His voice was rough, quiet. He turned his horse and rode back into the dark and the snow. Caleb closed the shutters, turned around. Maggie was standing in the middle of the room. Her face was pale and hard, and there was no surprise in it at all, only the worn, smooth look of a woman receiving confirmation of what she had already known. Eliza stood beside her, hand gripping her mother's coat, watching Caleb. "How many?" Maggie said. 8, maybe more by morning. He leaned the rifle against the wall. 3 to 4 hours behind. Maggie nodded, once. Precise. She reached for her coat. "What are you doing?" Caleb said. "What I should have done before I knocked on your door." Her voice was level. "I'm leaving. We'll take the mare north." "The mare is done. She won't make 5 miles in this cold." "Then we'll walk." "You'll die." "That's my problem." "Mrs. Cole." His voice came out harder than he intended. She stopped, looked at him. "You and your girl walk out that door tonight. You're dead before sunrise. The storm's picked back up. Your horse is spent, and Stokes's men know this area better than you do." He held her gaze. "That's not me trying to keep you. That's the plain truth." Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were calculating, fierce, and somewhere behind all of it was the thing she wouldn't let show. Exhaustion so deep it had become part of her bones. "If we stay," she said, "they come here. They come here, you're in this." "I'm already in it." He said it simply, like a fact he'd just discovered about himself and had decided, between one breath and the next, to accept. "You knocked on my door. I opened it. That's done. You don't owe us anything." "No," he agreed, "I don't." She stared at him. "Then why?" Caleb looked at Eliza. The girl was watching him, with the note's words still hanging in the air between them, as legible as if she'd held the paper up again. "My papa would want me to ask." He reached into his coat, took out the note, set it on the table between them. "Because somebody should have stood up for Aaron Webb," he said quietly, "and I didn't." He met Maggie's eyes. "I'm standing now." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, but the guard moving aside just far enough to show what was underneath it. Something careful, something that had been hurt too many times to come forward easily. "I don't know who Aaron Webb is," she said. "No, ma'am, you don't need to." He picked up the rifle. "What I need is to know everything in that journal. Names, dates, places, all of it. Because if those men reach this door, the only thing that stops them is the truth being too far along to kill." A silence. Then Maggie reached into her coat and drew out the journal. It was small, dark leather cover, worn at the corners. Thomas Cole's name written on the inside front in careful ink. She held it for a moment with both hands, held it the way you held the last piece of someone you'd loved. And then she set it on the table in front of Caleb. "It's all there," she said. Her voice was steady. "Everything Thomas found. Every name, every date." She looked at him. "My husband died for that book." "Then we're going to make sure he didn't die for nothing," Caleb said. Outside, the blizzard roared against the walls of the cabin. The fire burned low and steady. Eliza crossed the room without a sound, picked up the small piece of slate that was propped against the wall, left there from some previous winter when Caleb had tried to teach himself something and given up, and wrote 3 words on it in careful, deliberate chalk. She held it up so Caleb could read it. "We trust you." Caleb looked at those 3 words for a long time. Then he pulled out a chair, sat down, and opened Thomas Cole's journal to the first page. They had 3 hours, maybe less. It would have to be enough. Caleb read through the night. The journal was dense. Thomas Cole had been a methodical man, the kind who dated every entry and named every source and cross-referenced every document with the careful precision of someone who understood that truth without evidence was just noise. 43 pages. Names Caleb recognized. Names he didn't. 3 county sheriffs, 2 circuit judges, a land attorney out of Cheyenne who'd filed over 60 fraudulent deed transfers in 18 months. And at the center of all of it, like a spider at the heart of a web that stretched across 4 counties, Harlan Stokes. Maggie sat across from him and answered his questions without flinching. She'd clearly gone over this material so many times that it had become something separate from grief. A case file, a weapon, the thing she'd kept herself alive to deliver. Eliza slept on the bench near the fire, curled small under Caleb's spare blanket, her breathing deep and even. Children could do that, Caleb thought. Find sleep in the middle of catastrophe because their bodies demanded it. He envied her that. "This deed transfer here," Caleb said, pointing to a page. "The Halverson family. Thomas says the signature is forged, but he doesn't say how he knew." He compared it to a letter Harold Halverson had written to the county land office in 1871, Maggie said. Thomas got a copy of the original through a clerk he trusted. The signatures don't match on 11 separate letter formations. She paused. Thomas was very precise. "I can see that. He was a preacher who should have been a lawyer." Something moved across her face. Quick, gone. He used to say the 2 professions were more similar than people admitted. Both required you to make a case to people who'd already made up their minds. Caleb looked at her over the journal. "He sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I ever knew." She said it without decoration, flat and absolute. The way you stated things you'd stop needing to defend. "He wasn't perfect. He was stubborn, and he worked too much, and he forgot to eat when he was deep in something." A beat. "But he was good. Bone-deep good. The kind that cost him." Caleb looked back at the journal. "The kind that costs most." She was quiet for a moment. "You said you worked for the law once," she said. He kept his eyes on the page. "I did." "What happened?" The fire shifted. A log settled. "I testified against a man," Caleb said. "His name was Aaron Webb, homesteader over in Nebraska Territory. He was accused of robbery and assault on a freight driver." He turned a page. Didn't read it. "I was a deputy marshal. I'd been at the scene. I told the court what I saw." "And what did you see?" "I saw a man running from the direction of the attack." He paused. "I saw Aaron Webb running. And I told myself that was enough. That the evidence was solid, and I was telling the truth, and the court would sort the rest." His jaw tightened. Aaron Webb was convicted, sentenced to hang. Maggie said nothing. 3 months after the execution, Caleb said, the real man confessed. Another drifter had a crisis of conscience in a saloon in Kansas and started telling anyone who'd listen. He closed the journal carefully, set his hands flat on the table. Aaron Webb had a wife, 2 daughters, 7 and 9 years old. Silence. "It wasn't your fault," Maggie said quietly. "I've heard that." His voice was even. "Doesn't change what happened." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "But punishing yourself in a cabin in Wyoming for 8 years doesn't change it either." He looked at her. She didn't flinch. "I'm not judging you, Mr. Horne. I've spent 3 months running, and I know what it looks like when a person decides the only safe place is away from everything. I understand it." A pause. I just don't think it works. No, Caleb said slowly. It doesn't. They looked at each other across the table, and across Thomas Cole's journal, and across all the accumulated weight of things that had gone wrong in both their lives, and something passed between them. Not tenderness, not yet. Too early and too dangerous for that. But recognition. The specific recognition of two people who had both learned the same hard lesson and were sitting in the wreckage of it. Caleb opened the journal again. There are two men named in here who might still be reachable, he said. Pete Dalloway runs a dry goods in Millhaven. Thomas has him listed as a witness to one of the forced sales. And Ruth Abernathy. She runs the boarding house in Dalton Springs. Maggie's head came up. I know that name. Thomas mentioned her. He said she was the one who first told him about the Halverson family. She's been in this valley 20 years. Knows everyone, knows everything. If Stokes hasn't bought her, she's an ally worth having. He paused. And Dalton Springs is on the road to Cheyenne. Can we trust her? I don't know, but Thomas did. He met her eyes. That carries weight with me, given everything else in this book. Maggie nodded slowly. What's your plan? Get you and Eliza to Ruth Abernathy in Dalton Springs, 12 miles south. From there, Ruth has connections to the stage line and, more importantly, to a circuit preacher named Hollis who rides to Cheyenne twice a month. He leaned forward. Thomas's journal goes with the preacher. We send copies. I'll write copies tonight, as many as I can, to the federal marshal's office, to the territorial newspaper in Cheyenne, and to the land registry. We flood the channels, make the truth too wide to dam. Maggie stared at him. You'd do that. Write copies. I'm slow, he said plainly. My writing isn't good, but it's legible. He paused. You'd need to check everything I copy. I can do that. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When did you learn? Taught myself, mostly. A beat. I had a lot of winters. Something crossed her face, something soft and complicated that she pulled back before it could fully form. She looked down at the journal. All right, she said. We copy what we can tonight. Then we move at first light, if the storm breaks. And if Stokes's men reach us before first light? Maggie's chin lifted. Then we make it hard for them. Yes, ma'am, Caleb said. We do. He found paper in the chest under the window. Old, slightly damp, but usable. He found 2 pen nibs that weren't completely ruined. He set them on the table, and they went to work. Maggie reading aloud from the journal in a low, steady voice, while Caleb copied in his careful, labored hand, each letter deliberate, each line of evidence transferred from Thomas Cole's pages to new paper that could be sent in 4 different directions. They worked without speaking much. The fire burned. The storm howled and occasionally quieted and howled again. Eliza slept. Sometime past midnight, Maggie stopped reading mid-sentence. Caleb looked up. She was staring at a page in the journal. Her face had gone very still. What is it? She didn't answer immediately. Her finger was on the page, on a paragraph near the bottom. And Caleb watched her read it twice, 3 times. Watched something move through her expression that she was working hard to control. Thomas wrote this 4 days before he died, she said finally. Her voice was careful, held tight. I'd never read this far. I copied out the evidence sections, but I never... She stopped. I never read the last entries. She turned the journal so Caleb could see, but she read it aloud instead of waiting for him to work through it. I know they're watching the church now, she read. I know what that means. If something happens to me, Maggie will know what to do. She's the strongest person I've ever known, though she doesn't believe it. I want to write that down so it exists somewhere. Maggie is strong enough for anything this world puts in front of her. I've always known that. I should have told her more." Her voice cracked on the last word. She kept going. "Eliza has her mother's eyes and her mother's heart, and she will be all right. Whatever happens, she will be all right. I am not afraid for them. I am only sorry I won't be there to see who they become." The last word fell into silence. The fire crackled. Maggie closed the journal, set her hands flat on its cover. She was breathing in a measured, controlled way that Caleb recognized. The breathing of someone who had decided they were not going to break right now. Not here. Not in front of a stranger. Because there was still too much left to do. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer comfort or explanation or any of the useless words that people reached for when they didn't know what else to do. He simply sat there and let her have the moment. Let her grief take up the space it needed without rushing her through it. After a while, she looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her face was composed. "He was right," she said. "About one thing." A pause. "I don't believe it." "That you're strong enough? That I'm strong at all?" She looked at the journal. "I've been running for 3 months, Mr. Horne. I've been sleeping in barns and riding in freezing dark and telling Eliza everything will be fine while having absolutely no evidence that it will be." Her voice was quiet, honest. "I don't feel strong. I feel like a woman who's been holding a wall up with her bare hands and is very, very tired." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "That's exactly what strength looks like," he said. "It doesn't feel the way people think it does. It just feels like not quitting." She looked at him. "You're still here," he said simply. 3 months and 2 days. Eliza's still here. Thomas's evidence is still here." He touched the copies he'd been making. "That's not luck, Mrs. Cole. That's you." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away, back at the journal, and he saw her swallow once, hard. And then she straightened her shoulders and picked up the pen. "We should keep copying," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. They kept copying. An hour before dawn, a sound pulled Caleb to his feet. Not hoofbeats this time, something else. A crack, sharp and deliberate, from the direction of the barn. He was at the door with a rifle before Maggie could speak. He held up one hand. "Stay." And she nodded, already moving to Eliza, already putting herself between the child and the door. Caleb opened the door and stepped into the cold. The blizzard had eased to a hard, steady fall. 2 inches of new snow on the ground. The barn door was shut. Everything looked still. Then he heard it again. A voice, low, urgent, coming from the far side of the barn. He moved along the wall, rifle up, until he could see around the corner. A man stood there, older, heavy-set, stamping his feet against the cold, his back to Caleb. He was talking to someone, a second man, shorter, on horseback, barely visible in the dark and snow. "Told you, I don't know anything about a woman." "Don't waste my time, Dobbins." The man on horseback had a flat, hard voice, bored in a way that was more threatening than anger. 2 horses came off the north road tonight. We tracked the second set to your fence line." The man on foot, Dobbins, a name Caleb didn't know, shifted his weight. "Storm could have pushed any kind of animal off. The tracks are shod. Both sets. One of them is carrying 2 people." The rider leaned down. "You've got one chance to point me in the right direction before this gets difficult." Caleb stepped around the corner of the barn. Both men turned. The rider's hand went for his coat. "Don't," Caleb said. The rider stilled. His eyes moved from Caleb's face to the rifle and back. He was mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing a good coat that hadn't come cheap. Not a drifter. A hired man who was paid well enough to own decent clothes. Caleb Horne, the writer said. He said it the way men said a name when they already knew it, when they'd been told it before they rode out. "That's right," Caleb said. "You know who I work for." "I have a good idea." The writer nodded slowly. He wasn't afraid. That was the trouble with men like this. They'd been told enough times that the name behind them was bigger than anything in front of them, that fear had stopped occurring to them as an option. "Then you know there's no version of this that ends well for you if you point that rifle at me." "Might be," Caleb agreed. "Take your hand out of your coat." A pause. The rider took his hand out of his coat. "Now turn your horse around," Caleb said. "Ride back the way you came, and tell whoever sent you that there's nothing on this ridge worth their trouble. And if I don't believe that, then you can get off that horse and we can discuss it the hard way." Caleb held the man's gaze, level, unhurried. "But I'll tell you plain, I've got 2 rifles and a good position, and the cold doesn't bother me much. So you think about how that discussion is likely to go before you decide." The rider looked at him for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, measuring angles, measuring odds, measuring the specific quality of stillness in Caleb's hands, and whether it was the stillness of a bluffing man or a certain one. He turned the horse. "Governor Stokes doesn't forget," he said over his shoulder. "No," Caleb said. "I don't expect he does." The rider moved off into the dark and the snow. Caleb stood and watched until the sound of hooves faded entirely. Then he turned to the man called Dobbins. He was maybe 60, barrel-chested, with the wind-burned face of a man who'd spent most of his life outside. He was staring at Caleb with an expression somewhere between relief and terror. "Who are you?" Caleb said. "Abel Dobbins," the man swallowed. "Got a place 2 miles east. That rider came up on me while I was checking my fence line." He looked at Caleb carefully. "You've got them, haven't you? The widow and the girl." Caleb said nothing. "I knew Thomas Cole," Dobbins said quietly. "Not well, but I knew him. Good man." He looked at the ground. "My neighbor, Ed Greer, lost his homestead to Stokes's lawyers last spring. 40 years his family had that land." His jaw tightened. "Ed didn't fight it because he didn't think there was any point, because men like Stokes always win." "Do they?" Caleb said. Dobbins looked up. Something shifted in his face. Maybe not always. He reached into his coat slowly, carefully, watching Caleb's rifle. Pulled out a folded paper. "I've got a letter from a woman named Ruth Abernathy in Dalton Springs. She sent it to every homesteader in the county 3 weeks ago." He held it out. "She's been telling people to keep their heads down and wait. Says she's building something. Says when the time is right, people need to be ready to speak up." Caleb took the letter, read it. Ruth Abernathy's handwriting was bold and slanted and absolutely certain of itself. "She knows you're coming," Dobbins said. "I don't know how, but she wrote that letter 3 weeks ago, and it says to watch for a woman with a journal and a child who doesn't speak, and to help them however we can." Caleb folded the letter, put it in his coat. Thomas Cole, he thought, had been a very thorough man. "I need 2 things from you," Caleb said. "A sound horse, if you've got one to spare, and your silence." Dobbins nodded without hesitating. "My roan is in better shape than most. I'll bring her around to your barn." He looked toward the cabin. "The rider will report back. They'll send more men. You've maybe got until mid-morning before a bigger group rides up." "I know." "You're not afraid?" It wasn't quite a question. Caleb thought about Aaron Webb, about 8 years in a cabin that had never been a home. about a small girl pressing a folded note into his hand with eyes that had already forgiven the world for more than the world deserved. "I'm afraid of the right things," he said. He went back inside. Maggie was standing in the center of the room, with Eliza awake beside her, the girl's hand in hers, both of them looking at Caleb with the steady, measured attention of people who had learned to read the news in a person's face before they could open their mouth. "One rider," Caleb said. "He's gone for now. But there'll be more by mid-morning." Maggie's face was composed. Eliza's was still. "Then we leave at first light," Maggie said. "Yes." He crossed to the table, picked up the copied pages, 12 in all, the most critical evidence from Thomas's journal, names and dates and forged signatures, and the testimony of 11 families who'd lost their land. He folded them carefully and divided them into 3 packets. "One packet goes with you and Eliza. One goes in the lining of this coat." He picked up his old trail coat from the hook by the door. "One we leave here, hidden, in case everything else goes wrong." "In case we're taken," Maggie said. "In case everything goes wrong," Caleb repeated firmly. She looked at him. "You're very calm." "I'm not calm," he said honestly. "I just know what I'm doing." He wrapped one of the packets inside the lining of his coat, stitched it fast with a needle and thread from the kit in the chest under the window. His stitches were ugly. They held. While he worked, Eliza crossed the room and picked up the slate from the floor where she'd left it. She wiped it clean with her sleeve and wrote something new, turned it to show Caleb. "Are you scared?" He looked at the words, then at her. "Yes," he said honestly. She nodded, like that was the right answer. Like honesty was what she'd been checking for. She wiped the slate again, wrote again, showed him. "Good. Papa said only scared people are brave." Caleb looked at that for a long moment. Then he picked up his rifle and his coat and the 3 packets of truth that a dead man had spent his life building, and he said, "Your papa was right." Outside, the snow kept falling. Somewhere to the south, Stokes's men were riding. And Caleb Horne, for the first time in 8 years, was moving toward something instead of away from it. They rode out before the sun was fully up. 3 people on 2 horses moving south through a world gone white and silent. Dobbins's roan was steady under Maggie and Eliza, and Caleb's own horse, a gray gelding named Nothing because Caleb had never seen the point in naming horses, moved through the new snow without complaint. The storm had settled into something quieter overnight. Not gone, but tired, dropping flakes in a slow and steady curtain, rather than the wall of white it had been at midnight. Caleb rode slightly ahead. Not because he'd decided to. It was just how his body arranged itself when there was threat behind and unknown ahead. The old instinct from years of riding into situations that could go wrong in any direction. The positioning of a man who wanted to see what was coming before it saw him. He kept listening behind them. Nothing yet. But nothing yet was different from nothing. Maggie rode without complaint and without conversation for the first mile. Eliza sat in front of her, wrapped in the extra blanket Caleb had tied around the girl before they left. Her small back straight, her eyes moving across the landscape with that same quiet attention she turned on everything. Caleb had noticed that about her. She watched the world the way experienced trackers watched it, not looking at things directly, but holding a wide, soft focus that caught movement at the edges. She reminded him, painfully, of someone. He couldn't place who, and then he could. She reminded him of Aaron Webb's older daughter, the 9-year-old who had stood in the courthouse doorway the day of the verdict and looked at Caleb with eyes that held no accusation, only that same quiet, absolute attention. He pushed the thought down and kept riding. "How far to the main road?" Maggie asked. 3 miles. We'll hit it near the old Garrity fence line." He glanced back. "Once we're on the main road, we'll make better time, but we'll be visible." "Can we avoid it?" "Not with the snow this deep. The horses will wear out in the drifts off-road before we're halfway there." He held her gaze for a moment. "We move fast, and we don't stop. If we see riders, we don't run. Running tells them everything. We ride normal until we know what we're dealing with." Maggie nodded. She understood. He could see that she'd already done this kind of calculation before. Already spent months making decisions about when to look ordinary and when to disappear and when to run, and which choice was likely to cost the most. Eliza turned her head and looked at Caleb. She held up 4 fingers. He looked at her, not understanding. She held up 4 fingers again, then pointed south, then made a small motion with her hand. Horses moving, the gesture unmistakable. Caleb felt his spine go cold. He turned and looked south. The road was empty. He looked at Eliza. "You saw riders? To the south?" She shook her head, held up 4 fingers again. Pointed east. East. Not on the road. Cross country. He pulled the gray to a stop and listened. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then he heard it. The muffled crunch of hooves in packed snow, coming from the tree line to the east, maybe a quarter mile out. Multiple horses, moving parallel to them. "They're flanking," he said quietly. Maggie's face didn't change. "How many?" "Can't tell yet." He kept his voice level. "They're not moving to intercept. They're tracking us, waiting for us to commit to the road before they close in." He looked at Maggie. "They want to take us somewhere open, away from any homestead that might have witnesses." "How do you know that's what they want?" "Because it's what I would do." He turned the gray. "We're not going to the main road. Change of plan. We cut west through the Abernathy timber tract. It's longer, rougher, but it puts us into Dalton Springs from the backside, and they'll lose the tracking angle." "You know this land well enough to navigate it in snow?" "Well enough." He looked at her. "Trust me." She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. Then she turned the roan west without another word. He'd asked her to trust him, and she had. He didn't take that lightly. He understood what it had cost her. 3 months of being failed by everyone who should have helped had made trust into something she rationed like food in a hard winter, given out only when the alternative was worse. He intended to be worth it. The timber tract was harder going than the open ground, just as he'd said. The horses picked their way through drifts and around deadfall, breath steaming, moving at half the pace they could have managed on the road. Caleb watched the tree line constantly. The sound of the other horses had faded, but fading didn't mean gone. It meant they'd lost the angle and were repositioning. And repositioning meant time, and time was what he needed. Eliza reached back from the front of the saddle and tugged Maggie's sleeve. Maggie looked down. "What is it, baby?" The girl pointed upward, into the canopy. Caleb looked up. A crow lifted from a branch 30 yards to their right, startled into flight by something that wasn't them. Something to the right. "Ride," Caleb said. Maggie put her heels to the roan, and the horse lunged forward. Caleb spun the gray and pushed it hard after them, crashing through a shallow drift, breaking into a small clearing and across it before the trees behind them moved. One rider burst through on their right, then a second. "Stop there!" The voice was loud, official, in the practiced way of men told to sound like authority. "Stop in the name of Governor Stokes!" Caleb did not stop. He rode hard across the clearing with his body low over the gray's neck and the rifle across his thighs, watching the roan ahead of him, watching Eliza's small body pressed flat against the horse's neck with Maggie's arm locked around her. They hit the far tree line, and the brush tore at his coat, and then they were through, and the sound of pursuit was behind them, closer than he wanted. A shot cracked, wide. Snow jumped 10 feet to his left. "Don't shoot again," one of the pursuing riders, shouting at the other. "Stokes wants the journal, not a dead woman." Good, Caleb thought grimly. That was useful information. They needed Maggie alive. Which meant they'd try to stop the horses rather than the riders, and stopping horses in deep snow from horseback was harder than it sounded. He came up alongside Maggie. "Hard left. Follow the creek bed. It runs straight into the south end of Dalton Springs." "How far?" "1.5 miles." She turned the roan left, and he turned the gray with her, and they rode into the narrow creek bed, and the horses found the frozen ground beneath the snow, and their pace increased, and the sound behind them receded by degrees. By the time the first buildings of Dalton Springs appeared through the trees, the pursuit had fallen back to silence. They didn't slow until Caleb could see the sign above the door of the largest building on the main street. Abernathy's Boarding House. Clean rooms, honest prices. The letters were painted bold and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone who'd done it themselves and hadn't particularly cared whether it was perfect. He pulled up at the back of the building, dismounted before the gray had fully stopped, and was at Maggie's side helping Eliza down before Maggie could speak. The girl dropped into his arms without hesitation, light as a bird, cold right through the blanket, and he set her on her feet, and she immediately reached up and took his hand. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Her eyes said, "We made it." "We made it," he said quietly. He knocked at the back door. It opened before his knuckles had finished the second knock, like someone had been standing on the other side waiting. Ruth Abernathy was not what Caleb had built in his mind from her letter. He'd expected someone older, or quieter, or softer in some way that matched his idea of a woman who ran a boarding house. Instead, she was 60 or thereabouts, built compact and solid, with gray hair pulled back hard and dark eyes that moved over all three of them in about 2 seconds, and apparently found what they were looking for. "Inside," she said. "All of you. Right now." She didn't wait to see if they'd follow. She simply turned and walked back into the warmth of the building, and Caleb looked at Maggie. And Maggie walked in, and he followed, with Eliza's hand still in his. Ruth's kitchen was large and warm, and smelled of coffee and bread and the specific smell of a place that had housed a great many people over a great many years. She was already pouring coffee by the time they were through the door. "Sit down before you fall down," Ruth said, setting mugs on the table without asking who wanted them. She looked at Eliza. "You, come here." Eliza went without hesitating. Ruth put a hand to the girl's face, checking for cold, checking her color, the practiced assessment of someone who'd cared for a lot of people in difficult circumstances. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. She pressed a mug of something warm, not coffee, something sweeter, into Eliza's hands and pointed to the bench nearest the stove. Eliza sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at Ruth with those serious eyes. Ruth looked back at her. "Your daddy told me about you," she said. Quiet, direct. "Said you were the smartest person in the family. He wasn't wrong. I can tell that already." Eliza's face moved. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than that. A movement of feeling that didn't know what shape to take. Ruth turned to Caleb and Maggie. "Thomas wrote to me in September. Said if anything happened to him, he'd try to get Maggie and the girl to me. Said I was to trust whoever brought them." She looked at Caleb. "You're not who I expected." "Who'd you expect?" "Someone from the church circuit. Thomas ran with preachers and newspaper men." She looked at him steadily. "You're neither." "No, ma'am." "What are you?" "At the moment," Caleb said, "I'm the man who got them here." Ruth considered that. "Fair enough." She turned to Maggie. You have the journal." "Yes." Maggie set it on the table. Ruth didn't touch it. She looked at it the way people looked at something that carried both enormous value and enormous danger. "Thomas spent 2 years building that case," she said. 2 years. He was careful and patient and thorough." Her voice was steady. "He came to me 6 months ago and told me what he'd found. I told him to be more careful, and he told me it was too late for that." A pause. "He was right." "He wrote about you," Maggie said, "in the final entry." "What did he write?" "He didn't write about you specifically. He wrote that he wasn't afraid." Maggie's voice was even. "He said he'd done everything he could, and the rest was up to the people he trusted." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Cole was a better man than this territory deserved," she said finally. "We're going to make sure his work matters. That's not sentiment. That's a plan." She looked between Caleb and Maggie. "I've been waiting 3 weeks for you. In that time, I've made contact with a federal marshal's deputy out of Cheyenne, a man named Aldous Webb. Straight, not one of Stokes's people." Caleb went still. "Webb. You know him?" "I knew his brother," Caleb said carefully. Ruth watched his face. She had the quality of a person who read faces for a living and didn't miss much. "Then you understand that if anyone in this territory wants to see Harlan Stokes brought down through proper law, it's Aldous Webb." Caleb understood it perfectly. Aaron Webb's younger brother. 2 years behind Aaron in age, a decade behind in the Federal Marshal's Service. Caleb had heard the name over the years, in the distant way you heard news about people you'd wronged. Heard he'd joined up. Heard he'd been posted to Wyoming territory. Had specifically not sought him out, because seeking him out would have required looking him in the eye. That particular debt was coming due, it seemed, whether Caleb was ready or not. "When can you reach Webb?" he said. "I already have. He's 3 hours south, riding up today." Ruth's eyes sharpened. "But there's a problem." "There's been a problem since October," Maggie said dryly. Ruth almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. "Stokes knows the federal office has been sniffing around his land dealings, knows a marshal's deputy is asking questions. He's moved to get ahead of it." She paused. "He's filed formal charges against you, Mrs. Cole, through the circuit court in Laramie. Murder in the first degree. Your husband." She looked at Maggie directly. "He filed 3 days ago, with a warrant for your immediate arrest." The room was quiet. Maggie absorbed it. Her face went through something. Anger, then grief, then something harder that settled in behind her eyes and stayed there. "He filed murder charges against me," she said. "For Thomas." "Yes." "Using his own judges." "Using Judge Perryman in Laramie, yes. Man's been in Stokes's pocket for 6 years." Ruth's voice was flat. "The warrant is legal on paper. If any law officer in this territory takes you into custody before Webb can move, you go to Laramie and you don't come back out." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at Maggie. She was not falling apart. He watched her decide not to. Watched the decision happen in real time across her face. The same deliberate, iron-willed containment he'd seen all night. She breathed in once, slowly. Set her hands flat on the table. "Then we move faster than the warrant," she said. "That's the idea," Ruth said. "Webb is bringing a federal writ that supersedes the circuit court warrant, but he needs the evidence in hand before he can act on it. Perryman will challenge him, and Stokes's attorneys will challenge him, and it all comes down to whether Thomas's journal and testimony can hold up in a federal proceeding." She looked at the journal on the table. "Can it?" "Yes," Maggie said without hesitation. "You're certain?" "I lived with that man for 9 years. I know his work." Her voice was certain and fierce and absolutely without doubt. "It will hold." Ruth nodded once, like that settled it. A sound from the front of the building, the main door. Ruth stood immediately. Her hand went to the counter, and Caleb saw, very briefly, the handle of a small revolver tucked between the flour tin and the wall. She moved it an inch closer to her hand without drawing it. "Stay here," she said. She walked through the door to the front of the building. Caleb heard voices, Ruth's and a man's, low. He couldn't make out the words. Maggie looked at him. He shook his head slightly. Wait. Eliza had set down her mug. She was watching the door with total stillness. Ruth came back. Behind her, a man, mid-50s, sheriff's badge on his coat, face that had spent a long time carrying a weight it wasn't fully comfortable with. The face of someone who'd made choices he was still arguing with himself about in the dark hours. Caleb knew the type. He'd been the type. "Sheriff Denton Price," Ruth said, with the tone of a woman introducing something complicated. "He rides for Millhaven County." Price looked at Caleb, then at Maggie. His eyes stopped on the journal on the table, and something moved across his face. Recognition, and behind it, something that might have been relief, like a man who'd been told help was coming and had just confirmed it was real. "Mrs. Cole," Price said. His voice was careful, formal, the voice of a man choosing his words like a man crossing ice. "I need you to understand my position before I say what I'm about to say." "I understand it," Maggie said. She held his gaze evenly. "You're Stokes's man." Price flinched. "I'm the county's man." "Same thing for the past 6 years, from what I've read." She nodded at the journal. His jaw tightened. "I have a nephew," he said. "He works in Stokes's land office, 22 years old. Stokes made it clear 2 years ago that if I stepped out of line, the boy would be—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm not asking for your sympathy, Mrs. Cole. I'm telling you the shape of the cage so you understand why the door has been shut." "And now?" Caleb said. Price looked at him. Took him in. "You're Horne. Caleb Horne. I heard your name this morning when the riders reported back to Stokes's foreman." He paused. "I also heard what you did at that ridge cabin. Turned one of Stokes's men back, alone, in a blizzard." Something shifted in the sheriff's face. Not quite respect. The precursor to it. That was either very brave or very stupid. "Could be both," Caleb said. Price almost smiled. Didn't. "Stokes is pulling riders in from 3 counties. He's not sending scouts anymore. He's sending an army." He looked at Ruth. "By nightfall, he'll have 20 men at minimum riding for this town." "Then we need Webb here before nightfall," Ruth said. "Webb's 3 hours out. Stokes's riders are 4. Price looked at the journal again, then at Maggie. "What's in it? Thomas Cole's evidence? All of it?" "All of it," Maggie said. He stood quiet for a moment. Then he unpinned the badge from his coat, set it on Ruth's table, looked at it lying there for a second. "My nephew," he said, "has been trying to resign from that land office for 8 months. Stokes won't let him leave." He picked the badge back up, pinned it back on. "When this is done, when Stokes is finished, I want the boy out clean." "If the federal case holds," Caleb said, "everyone in that land office who testifies gets consideration. That's how federal proceedings work." "I know how they work." Price looked at him. "I used to believe in them." "Maybe it's time to start again." The sheriff looked at Caleb Horne, a man who'd walked away from the law and was walking back toward it with a dead man's evidence and 2 people who needed protecting. And something in Price's expression shifted in a way it clearly hadn't shifted in a very long time. "What do you need?" Price said. "I need you to stall Stokes's riders when they hit the county line," Caleb said. "Not stop them. Stall them. Ask for paperwork. Dispute jurisdiction. Buy us 2 hours." "I can do that," And I need your word that if Stokes's men reach this building, you stand between them and Mrs. Cole and that journal." Price looked at him steadily. "You have it." He said it the way men said things they intended to keep. Caleb believed him, not because he was naive, but because he knew what a man looked like when he'd found the thing he'd been waiting to do. Eliza slid down from the bench. She crossed to Sheriff Price with her slate in her hand. He looked down at her, surprised.
She wrote something, held it up. Price read it. His face changed. He crouched down to her level, this big, weather-worn man in his sheriff's coat, and he looked at the small girl with the serious eyes and the silent voice, and he said, very quietly, "I knew your daddy, miss. He came to me 2 years ago with the first piece of what he'd found." He paused. "I told him I couldn't help. I've been sorry about it ever since." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she held the slate up again so Caleb and Maggie could see what she'd written. "Help us now. That's enough." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere to the north, the sound of horses moving. Distant, but getting less so. Caleb picked up his rifle. "All right," he said. "Let's talk about what happens next." The plan was simple, the way all plans were simple before they met reality. Price would ride to the county line and delay Stokes' riders on jurisdictional grounds. Demand written authorization. Dispute the warrant's geographic validity. Anything that bought minutes. Ruth would send her stable hand, a boy of 15 named Cody, south on the fastest horse in her barn to intercept Deputy Marshal Aldous Webb and push his timeline forward. Caleb would stay at the boarding house with Maggie and Eliza and the journal. And if Stokes' men arrived before Webb did, they would hold. That was the word Caleb used. Hold. Not fight, not run, not negotiate. Hold. Maggie looked at him when Price left and the back door closed and the kitchen was quiet again, except for the fire and Ruth moving purposefully through her building, checking windows, speaking in low tones to the 2 other guests currently boarding there, a traveling minister and an older rancher from out of county, both of whom Ruth apparently trusted enough to tell something of the truth to, though Caleb couldn't hear what she said. "Hold," Maggie said. The word in her mouth was careful, testing it. "We have the building. We have Price on the road to slow them down. We have Webb coming up from the south." Caleb set his rifle on the table. "All we have to do is not lose ground before help arrives." "And if Webb doesn't make it in time?" "Then we hold longer." "With 1 rifle?" "Ruth has her revolver, and I'd wager she knows how to use it." He looked at Maggie. "Do you shoot?" She met his eyes. "My husband was a pacifist." "That's not an answer." "Yes," she said. "I shoot." Thomas didn't know. Something about that struck him as exactly right. The specific practicality of a woman who'd loved the gentle man and understood that the world requiring gentleness and the world requiring harder things were both real and not mutually exclusive. He picked up the second rifle from where he'd propped it against the wall, the extra he'd brought from the cabin, the one he'd debated leaving behind and then hadn't, some instinct overruling the logic of traveling light. He set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it, picked it up with the ease of someone who'd done it before, checked the load with 2 efficient movements, set it back down within reach. "Eliza stays in the cellar," Maggie said. Not a question. "Yes." "She won't like it." "No," Caleb agreed. "She won't." They both looked at the girl. Eliza was sitting at the far end of Ruth's table, the slate in front of her, writing something with careful concentration. She didn't look up. She had the quality, Caleb had noticed, of a person who processed everything going on around them, while appearing not to, who absorbed conversations through the walls and drew her own conclusions, and then waited to see whether the adults would reach the same ones. She finished writing, turned the slate. "I'm not going in the cellar." Maggie closed her eyes briefly. "Eliza, I know what's coming. I'm not a baby. Papa said being brave means staying when you want to run." "Your papa also said you were the smartest person in the family," Maggie said. "Smart people know when to let someone else take the risk." Eliza wiped the slate, wrote again, held it up with the particular stubbornness of a child who has decided something and intends to make the deciding clear. "I'll stay in the cellar, but I keep the copies." Caleb looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at him. "She means the copied pages," Maggie said slowly. "The ones you made last night." "I know what she means." He looked at Eliza. The girl looked back at him with steady, unblinking conviction. He thought about what Ruth had said. "Thomas told me she was the smartest person in the family." And he thought about the note the girl had pressed into his hand in the dark of his cabin. The note that had changed the entire direction of his night and, he was beginning to understand, his life. "If something goes wrong up here," he said, speaking directly to Eliza, "those copies need to stay safe so Webb can still make the case, even without the original journal. You understand that?" She nodded once. "Absolutely." "Then yes," he said. "You keep the copies. You stay in the cellar with them no matter what you hear. You don't come up until I come for you or until you hear Marshal Webb say his name and rank." He held her gaze. "Promise me." She wrote, "I promise." Then, below it, "Don't get shot." Caleb almost smiled. "I'll do my best." Ruth came back into the kitchen. She'd changed into a dark dress from the light one she'd been wearing, and she'd added a heavy shawl that Caleb suspected was less about warmth and more about the additional pocket sewn into its lining, where her revolver now sat. She moved with the efficiency of a woman who'd spent decades managing crises that showed up unannounced at her door and had developed a personal policy of meeting them on her own terms. "Cody's away," she said. "Good rider, that boy. He'll reach Webb." She looked around the kitchen, took inventory of all three of them the way she'd taken inventory of her supplies, assessing what was there, what was needed, what could be made to work. "The minister in room 2, Reverend Hatch, has agreed to stay. He was in the war. The rancher in room 4 has a shotgun and says he's been looking for an excuse to use it on Stokes' people for 3 years. She said it without relish, matter of fact. I told him this might be his day. "You trust them?" Caleb said. "Hatch saved my husband's life in '63 at Chickamauga, and old Douglas in room 4 lost his north pasture to a Stokes land grab 2 years ago." Ruth's voice was dry. "I trust the ones who have a reason." Caleb nodded. "We should position people at the front windows before they arrive. Visible. I don't want them thinking the building is empty and deciding they can just walk through the door." "This is my building, Mr. Horne." Ruth looked at him with the specific patience of a woman who'd been running things longer than most men had been alive. "I know how to protect it." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I don't doubt that." She almost smiled. Didn't quite. "You want the front window or the back?" "Front," he said. "I want to see Stokes' face when he rides in." "Stokes won't come himself," Maggie said. Everyone looked at her. She was calm, calmer, Caleb thought, than she had any right to be. Or perhaps exactly as calm as someone who'd had 3 months to think about this moment and had spent that time preparing herself for it, rather than running from the idea of it. "He's too careful," she said. "Too political. He'll send his foreman, man named Crane, Edgar Crane. He runs the operation, The land seizures, the enforcement, everything that needs to stay off the governor's desk. She paused. Crane is the one who came to the church. The room was quiet. He's the one Eliza saw, Maggie said. Steady. Absolute. Caleb looked at Eliza. The girl had gone very still. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was the face of someone looking at something invisible and terrible, and refusing to look away from it. The particular courage of a child who decided that fear was something to be walked through, not around. Maggie reached across the table and covered Eliza's hands with her own.
The girl turned her palms up and gripped her mother's fingers and held on. Crane is dangerous, Maggie said. She was speaking to Caleb, but her eyes were on her daughter. He's not loud about it, not theatrical. He does what he's sent to do, and he does it completely. A pause. He's also smart enough to know that killing a federal witness with a deputy marshal 3 hours away is a very different calculation than killing a widow and her child in a field in the middle of the night. So he'll try to take you legally, Caleb said. Use the warrant. Yes. He'll want to get you out of this building and onto a horse before Webb arrives. Ruth had been listening from across the room. If he takes Maggie in custody under Perryman's warrant, even Webb can't pull her back without a prolonged legal fight. And Stokes's attorneys will bury that fight in months of proceedings, while Maggie sits in a Laramie jail, and Thomas's journal sits in an evidence locker that Stokes's people have access to. She looked at Caleb. This only works if we keep Maggie and that journal together and out of their hands until Webb gets here. Then that's what we do, Caleb said. He took his position at the front window. The street outside was quiet, snow-covered, the kind of deceptive mid-morning stillness that felt peaceful until you understood it. 2 hours, Price had said. Maybe less. Caleb watched the north end of the street, and he thought about Aldous Webb riding up from the south, and he thought about Aaron Webb, buried in Nebraska, and he thought about the specific debt that was attached to the name, and what it would mean to look Aldous in the face. He didn't let himself not think about it. That had been his mistake for 8 years, deciding that the way to carry a thing was to set it down somewhere and not go back for it. The thing didn't disappear. It just sat where you'd left it and grew heavier in your absence. Maggie came and stood beside him. You should stay back from the window, he said. I know. She stood beside him anyway, not touching, but present. Deliberately, consciously present. I need to see the street. I need to see it clearly before they come, so I'm not looking at it for the first time when it matters. He understood that. He moved slightly to give her a better angle. They stood together in the quiet. Tell me about Aaron Webb, she said. He looked at her. You said his name last night, she said. In the cabin. You said it like it was the reason for everything. She looked at him steadily. Tell me. He told her. All of it. He told her the shape of it the night before, but now he told her the substance, the trial, the testimony, the way he'd convinced himself that what he'd seen and what had happened were the same thing. The execution, the confession 3 months later, the ride out to Nebraska to see Aaron Webb's wife and daughters, and the fact that he hadn't been able to bring himself to knock on their door. I sat on my horse in front of that house for 20 minutes, he said. And then I turned around and rode west and kept going. He looked at the street. There is not a day in the last 8 years that I haven't known exactly how long 20 minutes is. Maggie was quiet for a moment. And now Aldous Webb is riding toward you. Yes. Does he know who you are? He knows my name. Whether he knows the connection... He stopped. Doesn't matter. I know it. What will you say to him? The truth, Caleb said. That I was wrong. That I'm sorry. That I'm trying to make it mean something. He paused. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not looking for it. I'm just not going to stand in a room with that man and pretend the thing between us isn't there." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "Thomas used to say that the only apology worth anything was the one you made after you'd already done the hard thing," she said quietly. "Not before. Not as a way to feel better about what was coming. After." She looked at him. "You opened your door in a blizzard when you didn't have to. You rode through a storm and turned back a man alone. You spent a night making copies of evidence by firelight." Her voice was level and true. "I think you've been doing the hard thing since we knocked on your door, Mr. Horne." He looked at her. Something in his chest shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in the stories preachers told, where grace arrived in a flash and remade everything in an instant. Quieter than that. The shifting of a weight that had been in one position too long, moving to somewhere it could be carried differently. "Caleb," he said. She looked at him. "My name. It's Caleb." He held her gaze. "You've called me Mr. Horne for 2 days." Something moved through her expression. Slow, careful, the specific movement of a person who'd kept formal distance as a matter of survival, and was deciding, moment by moment, whether to ease it. "Caleb," she said. It was just a name. He'd had it 42 years. But the way she said it, simply, directly, like a door opened rather than a door closed, landed somewhere he hadn't expected. He turned back to the window. The north end of the street was no longer empty. 6 riders, coming in slow and deliberate, the way men came when they wanted to be seen. No rushing, no urgency. The unhurried confidence of men who believed the outcome was already decided. The one at the front was lean and straight in the saddle, maybe 50, with a stillness about him that was not peace. The stillness of a man who trained himself out of urgency, because urgency was for people who weren't certain. Crane. Caleb had never seen the man before, but he recognized the type, the way you recognize a certain kind of weather. Not from looking at it, but from the feeling in your bones before it arrived. "Ruth," Caleb said, without raising his voice. "I see them," Ruth said from behind him. She'd moved to the doorway between the kitchen and the front room, revolver in her hand, unhurried. Caleb heard movement behind him, turned. Maggie was sending Eliza to the cellar. The girl went without argument. She'd made her promise, and she kept it, taking the packet of copied pages from the table and tucking them inside her coat with the careful solemnity of someone who understood exactly what she was carrying. She stopped at the cellar door and turned back once. She looked at her mother. The look between them was the look of people who loved each other past the point where words reached. Deep and certain and without performance. Maggie pressed one hand briefly to her own chest, then toward Eliza. The girl did the same. Then she went down the cellar steps and the door closed over her. Maggie picked up the rifle. The riders stopped in the street. Crane dismounted. He handed his reins to the man beside him and walked toward the boarding house door with the measured pace of someone arriving for an appointment. He knocked. 3 times. Polite. Ruth opened the door. Caleb stood back from the window, angled where he could see the door. Maggie stood against the far wall, out of the immediate sightline from the entrance, rifle at her side. "Mrs. Abernathy," Crane said. His voice was moderate, well managed. "I apologize for the inconvenience. I have a legal warrant for the arrest of one Margaret Cole, wanted for murder in Laramie County. I have reason to believe she's in this building." He paused. "I'd appreciate your cooperation." "Would you?" Ruth said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. "The warrant is signed by Circuit Judge Perryman and carries full legal authority in this territory." A pause. "I'd hate for this to become difficult." "You've been making things difficult in this valley for 3 years, Mr. Crane," Ruth said,
in the same pleasant tone. "I think you can endure me being a little difficult back." She stepped to one side. Caleb came into view. Crane saw him. His face registered nothing. He looked at the rifle, at Caleb's face, back at the rifle. "Caleb Horne," Crane said. "That's right. You're obstructing a legal warrant." "I'm standing in a woman's kitchen," Caleb said. "What you're carrying isn't law. It's paper with a stolen judge's name on it." Crane's eyes moved to Maggie. She held the rifle at her side and looked back at him, and there was not one single degree of fear in her face.
Something about that, the specific quality of her stillness. The woman who'd run for 3 months and had stopped running seemed to reach Crane in a place he hadn't expected. His expression didn't change, but something behind it recalibrated. "Mrs. Cole," Crane said, "I think you understand the position you're in." "I understand it very well," Maggie said. "I've been understanding it since October. But here's what you need to understand, Mr. Crane." She crossed the room and set Thomas's journal on Ruth's front counter, in plain sight. "Deputy Marshal Aldous Webb of the Federal Marshal's Office is 2 hours south of here with a federal writ superseding your circuit court warrant. Everything Thomas found, every name, every date, every forged signature, has already been copied and distributed to 4 separate locations." She looked at Crane steadily. "Including the name of the man who came to the church on October 14th, and the name of the man who sent him." A silence. Crane looked at the journal, then at Maggie, then at Caleb. His face moved through something, a rapid internal accounting, the kind that happened when a man recalculated his position and found the numbers had changed. "Whatever you're being paid," Caleb said quietly, "it's not enough for what comes next." Behind Crane, through the open door, Caleb could see the 5 riders in the street. They were looking at their boss, waiting. Crane turned his head slightly, like a man checking the position of pieces on a board. Then the sound arrived from the south end of the street. Horses, more than one, moving fast. Crane heard it. Every man in the street heard it. The 5 riders turned their horses toward the sound, and then stopped because 2 of them had already seen the badge and the blue coat and the way the rider in front held himself, like a man who'd decided exactly what he was going to do before he'd arrived. Aldous Webb rode in with 2 deputies flanking him, and he pulled up in the center of the street, and he was younger than Caleb had imagined. Mid-30s, Aaron's coloring, Aaron's jaw. And his eyes went to the 6 men in front of the boarding house, and then to the door, and then to Caleb standing in it. And the recognition hit both of them at the same moment, like a stone dropped in still water. Webb looked at Caleb for 3 full seconds. Caleb looked back. He didn't look away. He'd looked away once, in the courthouse doorway, and he'd been looking away from it ever since. He was done with that. Webb turned to Crane. His voice was carrying and clear. "Edgar Crane, I have a federal writ from the United States Marshal's Office superseding all territorial warrants pertaining to Margaret Cole, issued on the basis of new evidence in a federal fraud investigation." He reached into his coat and produced the document. "You and your men are ordered to stand down." Crane looked at the document, at Webb, at the door of the boarding house. He looked at the 5 men behind him, men who'd ridden for Stokes because Stokes paid well and won always, and the calculation had always, until today, come out the same way. Caleb watched them recalculate, watched it happen in real time in the set of their shoulders and the shift of their weight in their saddles, the specific movement of men deciding whether what they were being paid was worth what was standing in front of them. One man turned his horse, then a second. Crane watched them go. His jaw tightened. "This isn't finished," he said.
He said it to no one in particular, maybe to himself. "No," Caleb said, "but it's starting." Crane turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted. He rode north with the 3 men who'd stayed, not fast, not fleeing, just going. The way men went when they needed to report back and receive new instructions. Webb dismounted. His deputies stayed on their horses, hands on their rifles, watching the street. Webb walked to the boarding house door. He stopped in front of Caleb. Up close, the resemblance was worse and better at the same time. The same bone structure as Aaron, the same set to the eyes. But his own person entirely, his own years, his own weight, his own way of looking at the world, which right now meant looking directly at Caleb without flinching. "Horne," Webb said. "Webb." He held the man's gaze. "I'm sorry about your brother." The words weren't enough. They were never going to be enough. But they were true, and they were said out loud, and they were said to the right person. And Caleb understood, in the saying of them, that this was what he'd been carrying for 8 years. Not guilt exactly, not just guilt, but the undelivered debt of a true thing that needed to be spoken before anything else could move. Webb was quiet for a moment. "I know you are," he said finally. His voice was level, not forgiving, not condemning, present. "I've known your name a long time." A pause. "Right now, I need you to tell me everything about the evidence against Harlan Stokes, so I can build a case that sticks." He looked past Caleb to where Maggie stood with the journal in her hands. "Everything." "Yes," Caleb said. "Come inside." He stepped back from the door. Webb stepped in, and for the first time since it had all begun in a blizzard on a Wyoming ridge, Caleb Horne felt the ground under him stop moving. They spent 4 hours in Ruth's front room going through Thomas Cole's journal, page by page. Webb was thorough. Caleb had expected that. A man who'd spent years building federal cases in a territory where half the law was bought, had learned to be precise about evidence, to anticipate every challenge, to close every gap before opposing counsel could find it. He asked questions with the focused patience of someone who understood that the difference between justice and failure was often a single date, a single name, a single document that either existed or didn't. Maggie answered everything. She sat across from Webb with the journal open between them, and she walked him through every entry, every cross-reference, every family Thomas had interviewed, every forged signature he'd identified, and how he'd identified it. She spoke with the same steady certainty she'd carried all the way from the cabin, through the blizzard, through the timber tract, through Crane's arrival at the door. The certainty of a woman who had carried this material in her memory for 3 months, because she'd understood from the beginning that the journal could be taken, but her knowledge of it could not. Caleb sat to one side and said little. His job now was to watch the street. Price had returned 2 hours after the riders came in, riding hard from the county line with his coat open and his hat pushed back, and he'd walked in without knocking and handed Webb a folded paper before he'd even caught his breath. Caleb read his face and understood what it meant before Price said it. "Stokes is calling it a federal overreach," Price said. "He sent a telegraph to the territorial governor's office in Cheyenne contesting Webb's writ. His attorneys filed an emergency petition with the circuit court." "Perryman's court," Webb said, without looking up from the journal. "Yes. Perryman doesn't have standing to contest a federal writ." Webb's voice was calm. "He can file whatever he wants. It won't hold past Monday." "Today's Thursday," Caleb said. "Yes," Webb looked up. "Which means we have 4 days to build this case past the point where Monday's hearing can touch it." He looked at Price. I need every land record in your county office.
Original filings, deed transfers, anything with Stokes's land company's name on it. Price nodded. I can have them here by nightfall. I also need you to make contact with the families Thomas documented. Anyone willing to give a signed statement. Webb paused. Not just willing. Anyone who can do it without being so afraid that Crane's people can shake it out of them. Price was quiet for a moment. That's a shorter list than it should be, he said. I know. Webb held his gaze. Find me who's on it. Price left. Ruth moved through the building with her characteristic efficiency, providing coffee and food and the occasional piece of tactical information delivered with such matter-of-fact precision that Caleb began to understand she'd been running a kind of informal intelligence network for years without calling it that. She knew which of Stokes's men were genuinely loyal and which were purely mercenary. She knew the layout of the Laramie County Courthouse and which clerks belonged to whom. She knew that Stokes's most important land attorney had a brother-in-law in the federal land office in Cheyenne who'd been uncomfortable for 2 years and hadn't found a safe way to say so. Webb listened to everything she said and wrote it down. Mrs. Abernathy, he said at one point, looking up from his notes, how long have you been doing this? Doing what? Ruth said, refilling his coffee without breaking stride. Watching, collecting, building. Ruth set the coffee pot down. She looked at Webb with the direct, undecorated gaze of a woman who'd decided a long time ago that the most efficient way to deal with men who underestimated her was to wait for the moment when they stopped. Since my husband lost our north pasture to one of Stokes's forged deeds in 1874, she said. Harold couldn't fight it. The law was bought, and he knew it. She paused. He died 2 years later. Heart. She picked up the coffee pot again. I decided to be more patient. Webb looked at her for a moment. Thomas Cole knew what he was doing when he trusted you, he said. Ruth made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. Thomas Cole was a very smart man who came to the right person, she said. That's all. Caleb had gone to the cellar door when the work settled into its longer rhythm. He'd knocked twice, their agreed signal, and waited. The door opened. Eliza looked up at him from the bottom step with the packet of copied pages still held against her chest inside her coat. Her face calm, and her eyes immediately searching, reading him, reading the quality of the quiet upstairs, making her own assessment. It's all right, he said. Webb's here. You can come up. She came up the steps with the careful deliberateness she brought to everything. At the top, she stopped and looked around the room, took in Webb at the table, the journal open, her mother's voice steady and certain in the middle of a sentence. And something in her face changed. Not relief exactly. Something deeper than relief. The expression of a person who has been holding their breath for so long they'd stopped noticing, and had just, very quietly, begun to breathe. She crossed to Caleb and stood beside him. Not holding his hand this time, just beside him. Present. He looked down at her. She looked up, held out the packet of copied pages. Hang on to those a while longer, he said. We might still need them. She tucked them back inside her coat, nodded once. They stood together and watched Webb and Maggie work. The afternoon moved into evening. Price returned with 2 crates of county land records and 3 signed statements from families Thomas had documented. Not many, but each one solid. Each one given by people who'd clearly made a decision about fear and cost and come down on the side of speaking. Ruth cooked. The minister Hatch, who turned out to be exactly the kind of quiet-spoken former soldier that Caleb respected most, sat by the front window and watched the street without being asked. Old Douglas from room 4 cleaned his shotgun with the satisfied attention of a man who'd been waiting for a purpose. Around 8 that evening,
Webb set down his pen. He looked at the materials spread across Ruth's table. The journal, the county records, the signed statements, the copies Caleb had made by firelight the night before. He looked at them the way a man looked at a structure he'd been building and was checking for the first time to see whether it would stand. He said nothing for a long moment.
Then he said, "It's enough." The room was quiet. "It's enough to bring formal charges," Webb clarified. "Enough to get Stokes removed from office pending trial. Enough to void the Laramie warrant against you, Mrs. Cole." He looked at Maggie. "It's going to be a long process. Stokes has resources, and he'll fight every step. But the foundation is there, and it's solid." He paused. "Thomas built it solid." Maggie looked at the journal, at her husband's handwriting covering 43 pages of careful, dated, cross-referenced truth. She pressed her hand flat on the cover for a moment. Brief, private, the gesture of a woman speaking to someone who wasn't in the room. And then she lifted her eyes to Webb. "Will he be charged with Thomas's murder?" she said. "That will be harder to prove in court than the land fraud," Webb said honestly. "Crane is the more direct connection, and Crane will be arrested. Whether the chain reaches Stokes will depend on how Crane's people hold up under questioning." He held her gaze. "I won't promise you what I can't deliver, but I will promise you that I will not stop until every connection that can be proved is proved." Maggie nodded. "That's enough," she said. "That's all Thomas ever asked for. Not vengeance, just the truth told in the right place by the right people." Webb looked at her steadily. "Your husband was a remarkable man." "Yes," Maggie said, simply, completely. "He was." It was Ruth who noticed Eliza first. The girl had moved, at some point in the past few minutes, to the table. She was standing at the edge of it, looking at Webb. When he'd said Thomas's name, she'd moved closer. When Maggie had said, "Yes, he was," Eliza had set her slate on the table and picked up the chalk. She wrote something, pushed the slate toward Webb. He looked at it. His face changed. Caleb couldn't see the words from where he stood. He moved closer and read them over Webb's shoulder. "My papa said the truth was worth dying for. Is it worth living for, too?" Webb looked at the slate for a long moment. Then he looked at Eliza. She looked back at him with those eyes that had seen too much and refused to be diminished by it. "Yes," Aldous Webb said. His voice came out slightly rougher than the rest of his speech had been. "That's exactly what it's worth." He paused. "Your father understood that better than most men I've known." Eliza looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up the chalk again. "He would have liked you." Webb swallowed, nodded once. "I hope so," he said. Caleb turned away, not because the moment wasn't his to see, but because some moments needed a wall to stand on the other side of while you collected yourself. He was standing at the front window, looking at the quiet, snow-covered street, when he heard a small sound behind him. He turned. Eliza was standing there. She had her slate. She held it up. "Thank you for opening your door." He looked at those 5 words for a long time. 5 words that contained, in the compressed economy of a child who'd chosen silence over speech, everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. The blizzard, and the cabin, and the note in his hand, and the ride through the timber tract, and everything that had been set in motion by the specific act of a man deciding not to close a door, that everything in his life up to that point had been training him to close. "Your papa said being brave means staying when you want to run," Caleb said. He kept his voice level. "You've been brave every single day since October. You know that, don't you?" Eliza considered this. She wiped the slate, wrote, "I was scared." "I know." He met her eyes. "I told you, that's what brave is."
She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. Then she did something she hadn't done since she'd first walked into his cabin 2 days ago. She put the slate down on the windowsill, and she walked the 2 steps between them, and she wrapped her arms around his waist, and she held on. Caleb put his hand on her head. Light. Careful. He stood there and let her hold on for as long as she needed. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were dry. She picked up her slate. She looked up at him once more, and then she went back to her mother's side and sat down and laced her fingers through Maggie's. And the 2 of them stayed that way, leaning slightly together. The specific gravity of people who had survived something enormous and were beginning, very carefully, to believe in the surviving. 3 days later, Harlan Stokes was formally removed from office, pending federal charges. The announcement came by telegraph to Ruth's boarding house, where Caleb had stayed, because Webb had asked him to remain available, and because, if he was honest with himself, he hadn't been able to find a reason to leave that felt more solid than the reason he had to stay. Price brought the telegram himself, riding in from the county seat with his hat pushed back and something on his face that Caleb hadn't seen there before. A lightness, as if a specific gravity that had been operating on the man for years had suddenly reduced. Maggie read the telegram twice. She set it down on Ruth's kitchen table and put both hands flat on the wood and stood there breathing. Ruth said nothing. She poured coffee and set it in front of Maggie and stepped back. Caleb watched Maggie from across the room. He watched her take in the news the way a person took in something they'd been working toward for so long that the arrival of it landed differently than expected. Not triumphant, not resolved, but with a complicated quiet that contained both the thing that had been won and the permanent size of the thing that had been lost to win it. She looked up. She looked at Caleb. "It's not over," she said. "The trial will take months. Crane is in custody, but Stokes's attorneys—" "I know," Caleb said. "It could still fall apart." "It won't," Ruth said from behind her coffee cup, with the flat certainty of a woman who had been patient for 5 years and intended to see it through. "Not now. Webb knows what he's doing, and the foundation is solid." She set down the cup. Thomas made sure of that. Maggie looked at the telegram again. At her husband's name in official federal language, his death acknowledged as evidence in a criminal proceeding, his work given the weight it had always deserved. She pressed one hand briefly over her eyes. When she lowered it, she was composed. "Thank you," she said, to Ruth, to the room, to no one and everyone. Eliza came downstairs with her slate and read the telegram in Ruth's kitchen with the careful attention of a child who'd been following the shape of this story from the inside for months. She read it twice. Then she set it down and picked up her chalk. She wrote on the slate and turned it toward her mother. Maggie read it. Her throat worked. She nodded. Caleb moved close enough to read it. Papa would say, "Now keep going." He spent the following morning doing something he hadn't done in 8 years. He saddled the gray gelding and rode not away from something, but toward something. Back north, back up the ridge, back to the cabin he'd built as a place to disappear in. He rode with purpose, which was different from riding with direction, in the same way that living was different from surviving. He went to pack. Not everything. He didn't have much. What he had fit into 2 saddlebags and a bedroll, with room to spare. The accumulated material of a man who'd spent a decade making himself easy to leave behind. He took the Bible from the shelf. He took the letter he'd found tucked in his coat pocket the morning after they'd left. Maggie had put it there without telling him, and he hadn't found it until he'd reached into his coat for something else and pulled out a folded piece of paper instead. She'd written 3 sentences. Thomas always said the measure of a man was what he did for people who couldn't pay him back. You measured up. Come back to Dalton Springs when you're ready. He folded it and put it back in his pocket and looked around the cabin one last time. It had been a place to hide. It had served that purpose adequately.
But a place to hide was not the same as a home, and he'd understood the difference finally, the night a 9-year-old girl had pressed a note into his hand and made him remember what it felt like to be needed by someone who had no leverage over him at all. Someone who was asking purely because they believed he might be the kind of man who would say yes. He closed the door behind him. He did not bar it. Whoever needed shelter next winter could have it. He rode back to Dalton Springs. Maggie was on Ruth's porch when he arrived. She saw him come up the street, and she stood and watched him dismount with the same steady attention she'd turned on everything since he'd first seen her face by firelight in his cabin. Reading the situation, reading him, arriving at her own conclusions with her own competent mind. "I didn't know if you'd come back," she said. "I said I would." People say things. He looped the gray's reins over Ruth's hitching post and climbed the porch steps and stood in front of her. "I meant it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The winter light was flat and clear, and it showed everything. The tiredness still in her face, the particular intelligence in her eyes, the thing beneath the tiredness that was not defeat and had never been defeat, even in the worst of it. He'd watched her carry Thomas's evidence through 3 months of running, and a blizzard, and Crane's riders, and a night when she'd had every reason to take Eliza and go. And she hadn't gone. And now he was standing on a porch in Dalton Springs, looking at the woman on the other side of all that, and understanding with a clarity he hadn't felt about anything in a very long time, exactly why he'd ridden back. "Eliza's been asking where you were," Maggie said. "What did you tell her?" "That you'd be back." A pause. "She believed me. She didn't even ask why, just nodded and went back to whatever she was writing." Something moved through Maggie's expression, a warmth that she didn't try to contain or deflect. "She trusts you considerably." "She's got good judgment," Caleb said. "She does." Maggie looked at him steadily. "She gets it from her father." A beat. "And she's been practicing." The front door opened, and Eliza appeared with her slate and the look of a person who'd been aware of the conversation through the door for some time, and had decided the moment was right. She held up the slate. "You came back." "I said I would," Caleb said. She wiped it, wrote, "Good. Ruth says you can have the room next to ours until spring." He looked at Maggie. She raised her eyebrows in the way of a mother who has been maneuvered by a 9-year-old and has decided to allow it. "I may have mentioned to Ruth that the roads north are bad through March," Maggie said. She held his gaze, level, direct. A woman making a decision in real time and standing behind it. And that a man who knows this territory might be useful to have close while the trial is pending, and Crane's people are still loose. "That's practical," Caleb said. "Yes," Maggie agreed. "It is." He looked at her, at the careful steadiness in her face that was not withholding but was waiting. The patience of a woman who'd learned the hard way not to rush past the truth of a thing toward a comfortable version of it. He understood it. He had no interest in rushing either. He'd spent 8 years living in the absence of things that mattered, and he intended, going forward, to pay attention to them at the pace they deserved. "Then I'll stay," he said. Eliza nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd expected exactly this outcome, and had simply been waiting for the adults to arrive at it. Maggie exhaled once, barely audible, the sound of something set down that had been held a long time. She turned toward the door, paused, looked back at him over her shoulder with something in her expression that was the beginning of something, not finished, not named, but real and present
and growing in the particular way that real things grew, which was slowly and without fanfare and with deep roots. "Come inside, Caleb," she said. "Ruth made supper." He followed her in. The room was warm. The table was set for 4. Ruth moved through the kitchen with her efficient, unsentimental grace, and old Douglas from room 4 was already seated and telling Hatch a story about the war that was clearly familiar to both of them. And the fire was going strong, and the smell of food and coffee, and a house where people lived, filled the air the way those things filled a house that had a future in it. Eliza took his coat when he came in. Just reached up and took it, the practiced ease of a child operating in familiar territory, and hung it on the peg by the door beside Maggie's. 2 coats, side by side, on pegs in a warm house. He stood there and looked at that for a second and felt something in his chest complete emotion that had been interrupted 8 years ago and had been working its way toward completion, slowly and without his help, ever since. He sat down at the table. Eliza sat beside him. She pulled out her slate and wrote one word and held it up. Home. He looked at the word. 4 letters. Simple as bread, solid as ground, containing everything. He looked at Eliza. At Maggie across the table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her eyes on him with that quiet, certain warmth. At Ruth, setting food on the table, with the authority of a woman who'd built this place out of loss and turned it into something that could hold people together. At the room around him, at the fire, at the winter light fading outside the window and the warm light inside pushing back against it. Home, Caleb said. He said it the way a man said a word he'd needed for a long time and had finally found, not as something borrowed or hoped for, but as something true, as something that had been waiting for him all along, at the end of the road he'd been too afraid to stay on, that he'd finally, after 8 years and a blizzard, and a small girl's note pressed into his hand in the dark, found his way back to. Some men spent their whole lives running from the moment they broke. Caleb Horne had run long enough and far enough to know that the road away from yourself went in a circle, and that what was waiting at the end of it was not punishment, but the chance, if you were willing to take it, to become the man you should have been before fear convinced you to be smaller. He had taken it, and at that table, in that warmth, with those people, Caleb Horne stopped running. Not because the world had become safe. It hadn't. And Stokes's trial was months away, and Crane was still dangerous, and the work of justice was long and hard and never finished. But because a man could not wait for the world to be safe before he chose to live in it. Because choosing was the thing. Because Thomas Cole had chosen to write the truth down, and Maggie Cole had chosen to carry it. And Eliza Cole had chosen, at 9 years old and in the middle of a blizzard, to press a note into a stranger's hand and trust him with the most important thing she had. And Caleb had chosen to open the door. Everything that mattered had come from that. He picked up his fork. The food was good, and the fire was warm, and the people around the table were alive. And outside, the snow fell quiet and steady over Wyoming territory, covering the old ground and the old grief in clean white, the way winter always did, preparing the earth for what came next.